Okay, I want to welcome everybody to our event today. My name is Patrick Vardeman. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Accudata Systems. I hope everyone is enjoying their lunch. We're going to get the event started, the panel. And the way we're going to do this today is we're going to do brief introductions, and then we are going to get right into the topic around cloud. We've got some great panelists. We put together a great panel for you this afternoon. Enjoy your lunch. They're going to be serving entrees here in a minute, and then we'll wrap up with questions. We've got a raffle and a few other things to talk about, but with that, we'll get started. So the first thing I want to do is I want to welcome our guests today, and I'm going to start at this end down here. So Ismael, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your organization, I'd appreciate it.
All right. Hi everybody. I'm Ismael Carlo. I work for Fugro. Fugro is best described as a geodata company. We basically study the Earth, collect data about it, and help our clients understand what that means for them, whether they're in construction, oil and gas, large infrastructure, cable route surveys, power. So tremendous amount of industries. And for myself and my background, most recently, I spent about 3 years rolling out Office 365, Microsoft 365 for Fugro for about 11,000 employees. And now, as of this year, my role has changed to supporting our R&D division that uses cloud extensively, but also IoT and edge compute.
Thanks, Ismael. Sohail, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. So my name is Sohail Merchant. I'm the Senior Practice Manager for Data Center Cloud for Accudata Systems. Before this, I was actually built multiple private clouds for very large financial organizations, specifically JP Morgan and Bank of America. They're very big about data privacy, and so they were more into trying to build their own internal cloud than go public, which in the last year or so that has changed, and they are becoming more public. So, okay.
Jovita, go ahead.
Jovita, so I work for Microsoft. It's a small company that some of you have heard of, but I focus on Azure. I spent some time with Accudata before going back to Microsoft. Over there at Microsoft, I would say combined, minus the time I spent with Accudata, about 18 years. Spent a lot of time up in Redmond, some of which I worked with a team that is today building Azure. So I can talk to some of the Azure internals. About 8 years or so at Microsoft, mostly helping customers transform their businesses, whether it's facing security challenges and helping them address that, or innovating their products and services. So I'm here today to listen to your questions and see what kind of ideas, share with you best practices that I've come across over the years, and see how we could, together make our customers, embrace technology.
Thanks, Jovita. Jeremy?
My name is Jeremy Manning. I am the Chief Information Officer for Gulf Capital Bank. So unlike Microsoft, if you've not heard of it, my feelings won't be hurt. We're actually brand new. We're several months away actually from coming live and being one of the first de novo financial institutions in the Houston Metroplex, and doing it pretty fast and furious, embracing some of the newer technologies as we're talking about as a panel today, to kind of bring that to home. Traditionally, where de novos would take multiple years of going through capital raise, building out infrastructure, turning things on, we're looking to do it in under 18 months. Past life, came from the world of banking previously for about 11 years over infrastructure and IT, and then took a couple of sideways turns where I worked for a small oil gas bulk fuel distributor, and then most recently came from a managed security provider where I led a team of threat researchers, malware analysis analysts that worked on supporting global clients around the constant daily threat we see in cybersecurity.
Thanks, Jeremy. Charles, you want to introduce yourself and then we'll get going?
All right, my name is Charles Johnson. I am the cybersecurity practice manager for Accudata Systems. I am really focused, and I have been focused for the last 20 years on either helping people solve problems, business problems, and making sure that those solutions are secure, or leveraging some of the current solutions and making sure that they can enable their business without the security being the naysayers for what they need to do. So I've been doing that for some oil and gas companies. I've done that for really large Fortune 1 companies and really small mom and pop companies. And the problems are generally the same. And I'm really excited to share some of the solutions that we found here with you guys today.
Okay, so we've got a great panel, and the idea here is we know from our experiences working with customers that whether you're planning on moving to the cloud or maybe you're already in the cloud, there's a lot of challenges. The security model is different. Obviously, the cost model is different, the consumption model. And what we wanted to do today was put together this panel and gather questions, which we have, and walk through their experiences, what works, what doesn't work, things to look out for, and share that information with you today. And as we're going along, make note of any questions you have. We're going to carve out some time at the end to ask questions, and we certainly encourage you to do so. It is a very interesting topic. When we talk about the cloud, and my first question is going to go to Jeremy. When we talk about the cloud, Jeremy, one of the things when I engage customers and I talk to customers, especially senior IT leaders, the first focus typically is on disaster recovery and leveraging the cloud, whether it's Azure or another cloud provider, for disaster recovery purposes. So what challenges in your career have you faced when looking at the cloud as a DR solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's specifically coming from my background and looking at it as a financial institution, we're heavily regulated. And so ultimately, one of the biggest challenges we've seen historically has been getting actually the government entities, the regulated bodies to actually embrace that and acknowledge that it can be it can meet the needs and/or be reliable and secure. And over the last several years, you've seen a tremendous acknowledgement of that, and really now the shift has moved to, on the regulatory side, to really just look at that as saying, look, our expectations are you are to treat the third parties that you're dealing for disaster recovery and resiliency no different than if you're doing it in-house. So they're holding me to the same standards as if I was deploying my own IT, my own infrastructure for DR. And they look at us to meet those same expectations. So the providers have all realized that, and you actually see now where it's actually started to be baked into the platforms in a lot of cases through dashboards, as well as just some standard templates. For us, it's actually as a de novo with really looking to start from scratch with nothing and come to a full-fledged financial institution. It plays a large part of our strategy. Realizing that for me to be able to meet the needs of being specifically in the Houston community, knowing that we deal with hurricanes and floods, et cetera, it is absolutely expected of us to have high availability and to be able to continue to service our community through disasters. And as we looked at this, it plays a large part for us to be able to continue our program, be available regardless of what risk may be thrown at us. The flip side of it, though, is there are some caveats. There absolutely are some shortcomings and things you have to recognize. It's about understanding your services. For us, obviously, I cannot put my vault services or my ATM services into the cloud. Physically, I have to be able to still service our clients and provide them cash on a daily basis, whether it's a disaster or not. And so there are still gaps that I have to address, but it opens up the door of flexibility for us as we embrace the cloud and being able to look at how I recover those services that I still have to have physical facilities for, versus in the past I had to still have all that other infrastructure that would reside with it from a recovery standpoint.
So Jeremy, you touched on an interesting point, noting the flexibility. So it's flexible, but you have to make sure you understand going into it the limitations, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Again, you got to know what you're signing up for, and also it's really at the end of the day, specifically for us, when we look at the expectations of the Texas Department of Banking or the FDIC, you need to know what your service level agreements are.
Sure.
And if you have a need, specifically if I'm looking to place a service into the cloud that needs to be highly available and I need a 1-hour response recovery, I don't sign up for a standard SLA that gives me, next business day, and I may get a phone number and a voicemail. And so you need to understand specifically, first off, what your business needs are, and then understand where the vendor can apply to that. It is easy oftentimes to start low and ramp yourself up. I mean, it's just about taking a credit card, right? But you don't want to be doing that at the heart of or at the heat of a moment when you're dealing with a crisis. That's the last thing you want to do, about worrying to scale it up or deal with that.
So if we had a cloud provider here, we do. So I guess, Jovita, the question to you is, look at this from the manufacturer, the cloud provider perspective. What challenges do you see customers when they look to DR, cloud as a DR service? What are the things that you see, some things that you can make our audience aware of that are things they should be aware of when they look to Azure as a DR provider?
Right. So my experience has been that DR actually is one of the lowest hanging fruit for any organization that is still thinking about the cloud. The reason why I say that is because it is easy for services organization like Accudata to go in and show the value of disaster recovery in the cloud by laying out, number one, the cost benefit, right? If I don't know, is anyone here doing DR in the cloud? Another question, does anyone believe your disaster recovery cost is high? Like, is that something that you believe is a big line item on your bill as you are a CIO?
Everyone's lying if they don't raise their hand on that.
Right. So as a service provider and as a cloud vendor, we know very well that DR is very expensive. And not only that, in the past, unless you are hit with a disaster, you may never ever recover, right? It is really business continuity and disaster recovery. But most people who do disaster recovery, they back it up in a tape, they never recover. So as a provider, when we come in, we talk about, number one, we ask we ask those questions. Have you ever done a successful recovery of your current DR, right? Secondly, why are you paying so much for DR? And then thirdly, we actually bring in the new concept about DR, which is as a service. We call it DRAS, Disaster Recovery as a Service, whereby you do not need to have cabinets upon cabinets of tapes that may or may never ever work, right? And finally, we want to show them that your data center where you do your backup. I give the example of a company that was based out of New Orleans. They had their DR just north of the city. Katrina hit, their DR site was intact, but no one could drive out there because what happens in the city, right in Houston, we know that. All the roads are blocked. You cannot leave your house. You have power outages. So for disaster recovery to be in the cloud, you are actually not only shifting your business model, but you are doing so knowing that in the event of a disaster, your employees can operate from their home. The cloud service provider, I believe, Jeremy, you mentioned SLAs. SLAs is critical, right? We want to show that SLA is number one when you talk to a company like Microsoft or Accudata. You ask the one question: what is the what they call the RTO, the recovery time objective? Am I going to recover my critical services after 2 hours, 24 hours, or within a second, like with disaster recovery in the cloud? And folks like, myself will tell you, we can give you disaster recovery, an RTO of under 1 second. And people will be like, 1 second? We say yes. And the reason is because there is a convergence between high availability and disaster recovery. So what I want all of us to start looking at is that convergence where high availability is going away and DR is actually taking that role.
Jovita, speaking of high availability, do you feel like customers actually need high availability though? I mean, you're like right now you're talking about recoverability in a second.
Correct.
And I think most of the audience would be interested in, is that, it may be realistic, but do I need that? As a business owner, is that something I need to provide?
Absolutely.
What do you see in the field
Well,
today?
the answer is going to be it depends on the service, right? So if you are running a bank, or let's say you are the city of Houston and you are running traffic lights, you want those lights to be on all the time. Or if you are running...
Do you?
Right? So, but the question is, does it have to be that expensive? The old model was, you build this rack of servers over there, which is a failover rack, right? And you hope that, okay, if this one goes down, the active node goes down, you're going to failover. But we all know that when the National Institute of Standards and Technology defined cloud computing, one of the 5 essential characteristics of cloud computing is it has to be there all the time. right? It is that perception of infinite availability. So the cloud is built to give us that
Availability.
Availability,
So
right.
Charles, I want to come to Charles because you just heard Jovita's going to make everything online all the time, highly availability. What does that do for a security model though? Because a lot of organizations today, this is what I see. What I see today it's very reminiscent of VMware and VMware sprawl, where customers would start rolling out VMware and they did not apply a security model to it back in the old days. They thought, well, it's just virtual. It doesn't matter. And I've sat in meetings, I've sat across a lunch table from CEOs saying, Patrick, I mean, what's the big deal? It's Microsoft. Nobody's going to break into Microsoft. I don't think many customers fully appreciate or understand the security model. So now when we're talking about highly available services, what does that do to the security model?
It changes it because if you think about two things, one, and I think Jeremy said it first, you really need to think about the organizational goals for the service that you're putting into the cloud, right? And the real benefit of getting into the cloud is decoupling the infrastructure from the service that you're providing. And so that high availability becomes less about the gear. It makes it less expensive, and you get to focus on making sure that the service is more resilient. And so once I get to that point, then I'm looking at securing the service or the data that's associated with the service and not necessarily the infrastructure. So it should change the focus. If you go to the cloud and you literally bring your rack or your server back to the public cloud, you've sort of missed the point in actually getting the benefit of being in the cloud.
Do you see customers make that mistake though?
Oh, all the time, yes. And sometimes that's a lack of planning, or it is generally some fear, right? I want to make sure that I take this step first, and this looks the same, it feels the same, and so this is okay. And that is probably the most expensive adoption model for the cloud.
One of the things we've seen also with our customers is the security applications or the technologies, the look and the feel is totally different in the cloud. So if you take a firewall provider or a load balancer or any of the technologies that traditionally we would go rack a box in a data center and help a customer install it, it's much more complex and the interface is even different in the cloud. Is that part of the challenge where customers they want it to feel more normal in their current operation,
Yes.
and so that's where the mistakes start to happen?
That's exactly where the mistakes start to happen, and I understand it. I used to be a practitioner, so I did the same thing. But I think it's embracing the new frontier that is the cloud that sort of reduces those mistakes. And making sure that you lean on your consultants, lean on Microsoft, the resources that you have, and understanding first what you're trying to build, what you're trying to deliver, and leverage as much of the native services as you possibly can. That'll reduce your ancillary spend and actually keep you more secure because you have less moving pieces as a result.
So one, just to add on to that, one kind of follow-up question. We have many customers today who, let's say they're in the cloud. I can think of one retailer that we work with. They're in Azure, but they've got development teams in other cloud solutions. So talk a little bit about multi-cloud. And is that okay? Do you just have to have the right security model, or is it not okay and the preference is no, go with one cloud provider?
So I will pick on somebody other than Microsoft since Jovita is sitting here. There was, if you remember, around Christmas time last year, a gigantic outage with Netflix. Anybody remember that? That outage was with one particular cloud providers. I won't say their name either. Their DNS infrastructure was completely unavailable in a couple of the pops on the East Coast, which brought a lot of Netflix down. There was a bunch of other things that went down as well. Multi-cloud solutions would solve that problem. You also have the ability to take a look at your global infrastructure in a different way to make sure that resources are available with the lowest cost provider. And so you may find with good governance that, you know what, I'm with provider A, but you know what, this week the compute with Microsoft is way cheaper. Let's migrate over there. And if you decouple your solution or your service from the infrastructure, that becomes a lot easier for you to do. So
Sohail, I want to bring you into this because you oversee our cloud practice. Talk a little bit about multi-cloud, the projects that we've done or that you've seen. Is what Charles is saying? I mean, Charles is speaking from a security perspective, but what about just practical, operational, everyday living? Is multi-cloud a way to go?
So here's the challenge, right? A lot of customers have started, especially if you have a SaaS solution you wrote yourself, you have used APIs from your cloud provider to write your SaaS solution. Now you decided, I want to go multi-cloud. The problem you have is those APIs are specific to that cloud provider. So now you have to either figure out a way to rewrite the application, figure a way to containerize it, so you can actually start using multi-cloud. And then once you get there, you guys start looking at global load balancers, start looking at caching engines. The complexity dramatically increases. So the question I always ask, if somebody when they ask me, do I want to go multi-cloud? My question is, what is the outage worth to you? Is your outage for an hour, 2, or 8 hours worth enough for the complexity? Then do it. I can't answer that question. Nobody in this panel can answer that question. Only your business owners can answer that question. If it's not worth it, then it's better and smarter to stick with that provider. But I'll tell you exactly what I told one of the retail providers. Stop using cloud-specific APIs. Use some generic APIs, generic technologies that are multi-cloud available. Not because of if it's specific to that cloud, it has to do with your ability to be flexible.
So, kind of sticking on that point, what you're saying is you've got to you don't want to use, if you can, you don't want to use the cloud provided APIs to give you, the user, more freedom to leverage the cloud the way it was meant to be leveraged, right? So, Ismael, I'm going to bring you into this because you run IT for a very large organization. You're in the cloud. You've heard these guys talk about multi-cloud solutions and security. What are your thoughts on multi-cloud?
Sure. So Fugro, we're multi-cloud. We use 2 of the largest cloud providers in the world, and that brings a lot of challenges. And you would think, well, why would you end up there? And I think we're a good case study because we were a very decentralized business, and so that meant that each of our different entities could choose to run IT in a slightly different way as long as they were meeting all our global governance. And that led to having 2 cloud providers. Looking at it today, we have multiple petabytes of data in the cloud. If we want to shift from one provider to another, it's almost impossible. It's doable, but it's a huge challenge. And everything Sohail said is absolutely true. We experience that all the time. You can do things like put layers of abstraction in front of APIs so that you can switch between, let's say, Azure Blob Storage and S3. But it becomes more and more complex. And so you do have to decide, is it worth it? I think, at least based on our journey, I would say you really do want to make the decision to stick to one cloud provider if you're starting new. But then also, consider that. Who's your long-term partner? What does that look like? One other thing that we didn't mention on this topic that is a real serious consideration is cost. And not cost from the point of view of discounting or let's say what it actually costs you for computer storage, but the fact that you're managing multiple bills. So you're going to be billed by one company, you're going to be billed by another, and you've got to reconcile that. If you do chargebacks within your organization, that adds overhead that's unnecessary. So it's really exponentially complex to be multi-cloud. So I would agree with Sohail. Consider why you want to do it before you do it, and I do think that Charles's point about Netflix, if you are Netflix, you do need to solve that problem. But for our business, we've found that wherever our data is suitable. And one other point on multi-cloud is the concern about egress fees. What we've found, and this is just sharing this openly, egress fees are not really the biggest cost in the cloud. You're going to pay far more for storage and compute than you ever will for egress. So don't let that stop you if you're considering that. Also remember that when you transfer data between regions in any cloud provider, you also pay egress fees.
Can I add to that? Yeah. Can I add
Sure.
to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll take off my Microsoft hat here for a minute. So I 100% agree with what you're saying, right? The challenges and the complexities that having multi-cloud brings is enormous. What you touch on cost, the whole, what they call the cloud financial model, it's kind of different, it's challenging. But also the tooling. So if you have AWS team, you're going to have an Azure team, maybe a GC, a Google Compute Engine team. You're going to start thinking of how, you're looking for a unicorn now, right? not only that, but also think of your on-prem tools, whether it's some command line tool and all the different things that you have. So your operations goes up, the cost goes up. Now, for a large organization, though, that has footprint worldwide, and I know of some, there are some cloud providers that do not have presence in some parts of the world. And if you are a service provider like Netflix and you want to bring your data close to your end users, you may want to have multi-cloud. So take, for example, if you're doing business in China today, one of the easiest cloud to go with is Alibaba Cloud, right? It's just the way it is because it's the easiest. But not everyone, this is not a bill that would fit most organizations. I would think that shows it very carefully. I know it's something that many organizations wanted to do because they were not sure which cloud does what. Today, as we mature more and more, the cloud is fast becoming the utility. So if you think of who is supplying this electricity, we don't even know, and we don't need to know. Could be coming from Centerpoint Energy, TXU, whatever, we don't really care. We just want, so at the end of the day, it's going to depend on the contractual relationships that you have and the discounts that you get. Whether it's being served from AWS, Azure, or Google is going to be not much of a concern going forward. We are aware of that.
So, Jeremy, so you just heard, this is an interesting transition. You just heard Jovita talk about essentially comparing cloud to the utilities, right? Like the light switch. So when I walk in a room and I flip the light switch, the power just comes on. Ismael has an 11,000 user organization that's multi-cloud. What does this do to the culture? Because if I'm the CEO or the CFO now and IT has an outage and I'm paying for, I think you said split second high availability, I'm thinking, well, I should have no outages. I should have always on. If I flip the light switch and the lights come on, I mean, IT should work like that. So how does this affect the culture, both of your users and what their expectation is of IT, but also your own team and the perceptions they have about working in an environment like that?
No, I mean it's a fair challenge, and I think you see that challenge regardless of whether it's cloud or it's your own in-house support. And it's back to more often than not it's because the boss didn't plug the computer in or have it turned on, or he was clicking on the wrong thing.
I won't take any offense to that.
But it's a fair statement, and I think it goes back to understanding that high availability still doesn't mean we're constantly we're in the 10-digit nines, right? We're going to expect outages and deal with those, and we still have to have contingencies for especially the most critical services. So at the end of the day, there is setting that appropriate expectation. But the flip side too is just changing the dynamic of the conversation to more about understanding of the value that you're getting and the things that are being baked into the sauce. And for us, it's been really about the new features, functionality get rolled out on a continuous basis, and it's really encouraging the team to really embrace that and discover it. There's nothing better than having somebody on my own team come to me and say, hey, did you know you can now do this with Teams? Or I can now go and find out how to do this specific functionality, which I had no clue about. But it's really about them embracing and understanding the technology and the things that are coming with it that before, when I was doing it in-house and I had a team of 60 plus engineers and the racks and racks of servers, I struggled just to keep up with the latest service pack and patching. And so there's that constant balance. And the reality is, again, there's going to be outages. There's going to be that reminder that you can't put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. But you are still getting, from my perspective at least, I'm still getting far better service and availability than if I were to try to at this present time do it on my own.
Ismael, what about you? I mean, in terms of expectations of the organization, knowing that you're in now a multi-cloud environment, any thoughts you can share?
Yeah, so we went from being no cloud, all on-prem data centers, everything managed by the company. That was company policy from the highest levels of the company. To one day we said it's going to be cloud first from now on. And what that looked like is, if you've ever seen one of those Old West movies where they go claim their land, everybody just started running like crazy to go put as much data as they could in the cloud. And that's dangerous, because at the end of the day, you need to have controls in place. And ultimately, once you have multiple petabytes of data, you need to be able to find that data. Otherwise, you end up looking less like a junkyard where you can find the part you're looking for, and more like a landfill where it's just who knows where it is. So that thing for us changed our culture a lot, and it took a little bit of time to claw that back, so that to put the right controls in place and sort of train people on the right behavior, so they understand before you move data, you need to have these minimums met. The other thing that's really changed, and I think is really helpful, is that we no longer have to think about the steps that you go through to grow infrastructure on-prem. So if you think about it, today you have a storage device, whatever that thing is, a SAN or a NAS, and that has a certain amount of capacity, and it has a capacity limit before you have to upgrade to the next version. And so those things sort of become like cycles in your business, right? You know you're going to grow to a certain point, and then you're going to have to upgrade it. You know that thing's going to hit end of life, and you're going to have to replace it. In cloud, you don't have that. And what that does is it gives you much more flexibility to plan in a different way. The risk is, of course, that you grow and grow and grow, and of course your bill just gets bigger and bigger. But the upside of that is that you really don't have that limit, that those kind of big, hairy, audacious goals that the company will sometimes put out that seem impossible to IT because we can't provide that quickly enough. Those become very real, and that's become the culture of our company. Is people are very they believe that they can do anything because the capacity's there. And I just want to add one last thing. The downside of cloud is that with the amount of compute, with the amount of storage you have, you can also do yourself harm very, very quickly, right? There's been stories of companies that do trading systems, and they've traded themselves out of the market in one day with one bad line of code. So you want to protect yourself from that. So I think that those are all my thoughts on that.
So, do you want to add something?
Yeah. So, we talk a little bit about IT and culture on IT, but to me, if you look at like an individual contributor or even a manager or director at any company, what's the culture change for them, right? Think about the technologies we use, right? Think about what happened when text messages became real. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that. I'm not sure everybody is, but that changed. I mean, our communications, the speed of communications dramatically changed. Now you have technologies like Teams and SharePoint, and no matter what technology, not even if it's Microsoft, that's a dramatic impact, right? Now the other issue is release of features that you never even know released. Jeremy brought it up earlier, but the reality is that now you have a person that can go on Reddit, or they saw YouTube or something, they realize a new feature's available, they start using it. Now it's become like a virus. It's gone through your entire company. Right? You as IT...
It's like a bad science fiction movie.
Exactly. You as IT has no clue. Now you just found out because you're so busy doing your day job that there's new features everywhere, and then compliance is on you. HR is on you. And you have to go resolve those situations, right? So just be aware there's positives and negatives on both sides, and what you really need some kind of governance, right? So I'll pass it to you.
Well, okay, so let's talk about governance, which is something near and dear to my heart. Because as the leader of our organization, one of the things that I've struggled with this whole move to cloud and cloud applications is your analogy of the Wild West and everybody just running out and staking their ground. It could not be, I mean, that is absolutely the case. So I'm curious, Jovita, since you work at Microsoft, so I can say that you're part of my plight here. When you look at governance and governance models for some of these cloud applications, what advice do you have for customers? Because this is a real challenge, and we see this every day.
Right. So, and the some of our cloud vendors have not helped with this, right? When they came to talk to us, or I would say to you, meaning the customers, they talk of migration, cloud migration, which it's kind of misleading, because when you migrate to the cloud, I always use the rudimentary analogy of you moving from one apartment to another, right? You grab your things, you put them in boxes, you bring U-Haul, and you go to a new apartment. What has really changed? Not much, right? We see the cloud as a transformation. We just talked earlier about the Wild West and folks doing all kinds of stuff. Charles talked about, the security model changing. When the cloud by itself has 3 different service models, right? Infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and then software as a service. Underneath all of that is what we call the DevOps that cut across the different silos that traditional IT organizations have. So if you go to the cloud, taking with you your on-prem IT org structure, those land grabbers, the server team, the network team, the firewall team. Remember, when you are in the cloud, even in an infrastructure as a model, as a service model, you are cutting across the security and the network functions actually converge, right? So the need for governance is critical. To go to the cloud starts with governance. Fortunately, we have some really good governance practices. A company like Accudata, I know they're very good at coming in, sitting down with you, mapping out your goals. You talk, Jeremy, what do you really want for a bank? What are those regulatory frameworks, right? So when we sit down with any company to talk cloud, we start off with, what is a corporate policy? A whole lot of time, the corporate policies may not be enough because it's still on-prem centric. And then we start looking at regulations. And then we start looking at industry standards. And then we start looking at best practices and help them.
I think it's
across
interesting. We work with a lot of customers, and if you take like a simple well, it's not a very simple application, but take an application like Microsoft Teams. That's a great example of a powerful tool that can help enable teams beyond what they've been able to do before, but it can get quickly out of hand from a governance perspective because in many ways the end users learn more about the tool quicker than IT does.
Correct.
And they start really, leveraging and exploiting every possible feature that's out there. And so you roll out a tool like that, you've got to have a governance model to help control that because otherwise it can get out of hand really quick.
Yeah, not only governance, but also adoption and change management. And I'm going to pick on all of us, the IT folks in this room. We are very good at doing projects, right? We go in, we have this, envisioning, planning, design, implementation. Things start running, we say, where are we? We are successful and we leave. But we don't think about adoption. What you just described is a classic example of where IT folks bring in these tools, they implement it, but they don't do any kind of adoption and change management. And that's how things go out of hand.
So, Jeremy, I want to switch over to you. Obviously, as a chief information officer, years of experience. Now you're in a new venture. And so my question is as you've gone and built what is to become Gulf Capital Bank, knowing that it's a cloud-centric model, have you restructured the way you view your own IT department in terms of the roles in the organization and what you need?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think it's, again, de novo banks historically always start small, and what historically you see is this ebb and flow, the yin and yang of where they go with the minimum and then the auditors come in and find all these findings. They find they don't have good change control or governance. They don't have the skill set to recover, and then they staff up and bloom up, and then they, you go back and forth. And for us, it's really, especially as I mentioned, again, our aggressive approach and hitting the ground running is about really focusing and leveraging these third parties. And so, out the gate, and granted, we're not even open for business yet. I have today behind me, the seasoned professionals and expertise of not just like in this case Microsoft, but within the next 30 days, I'll have hundreds of security engineers with certifications, network engineers with the various certifications experience, as well as endpoint support, and it's still with being me as an IT staff of one. Because those are all those third parties and leveraging the cloud services as well as the service providers and the expertise that they bring to bear, so that for me, we're able to really focus on where we want to invest, which is back to my bankers, back to the relationship folks, the lenders, and really emphasizing that and not having this heavy burden of the IT that's really necessary, but slowing down the organization unless I bring those skill sets in-house, but being able to do that from using these third parties.
So, Ismael, unlike Jeremy, who had kind of a blank sheet of paper, right, and which sometimes we all sit down and think, gosh, wouldn't it be nice to just have a blank sheet of paper to design this? Global head of IT for Fugro, 11,000 employees. You moved to the cloud, but you've got this IT organization that was built for an on-prem world. What changes have you had to make in thinking through the internal operation of IT?
Sure. So I have to make a correction. My boss is the global head of IT. Yeah, so for us, we were organized. Our developer teams, we do a lot of software development. Our developer teams are organized around products. In the software development world, there's this thing called Conway's Law, and it says that your systems will be a direct reflection of your organization. And that's exactly what we've seen. You'd have one product team that was delivering a specific need for a specific business, and they would recreate all the same fundamental capabilities that another team needed, and there'd be almost no cross-team collaboration. And so from a software development point of view, one of the things that we've, as our journey has progressed, have realized is that you have to really carefully think about how you organize these people. You need to make sure you include DevOps, sort of IT infrastructure, traditional IT cloud infrastructure people in developer teams, because they need that support. They need somebody who understands networks and understands storage, databases, et cetera. But also, that you need to have, on the IT side, you're going to go, at least we did, go through a massive reskilling exercise. And that's taking the time to identify who are the people who are going to be retrained, sending them to courses, and that in and of itself changes your culture, because now you have people who were previously, let's say, comfortable working with hardware, and now they're very comfortable working with cloud, and that's a very positive thing. But your future looks very different from the old days of on-prem.
Charles, I want to come to you if you guys could pass the microphone down. And when we talk about the migration process to the cloud, and we've got organizations that we've talked about multi-cloud, we've talked about DR, we've talked about inside the organization, understanding DevOps. What lessons have you learned as you've seen these organizations do this from the security perspective? And then Sohail, I want to get your perspective on the data, or moving the data center architect to the cloud model.
I think the biggest lesson I've learned is that you want to assume that the adversary is watching you as you're building out your new infrastructure. And here's what I mean by that. It's really easy to compromise an endpoint. If you look at some of the larger breaches, it doesn't start with some back computer somewhere that nobody thought about, especially as they're building out the new infrastructure. It really starts with the developer. Some developer was using the same bit of code or reusing credentials or something like that, and that actually was the door that opened up to basically a breach that happened much, much later. And so you want to have that same level of governance that you have today, that same level of compliance that you have today, not after you get the cloud built, but as you're building the cloud. And every investment that you make, every hour that you build into that has to be secure. I think that's probably the biggest lesson.
Sohail, what about you? I'm curious, in the projects that your team has done and embarked on, just the lessons learned kind of through the migration process.
No, great question. So, first of all, most people play in the cloud when they first get there, right? They create an IaaS instant PaaS instance, whatever. And somehow, overnight, it becomes production. And then once that happens, you have all kinds of risks. And we had a pretty decent-sized health customer who had a big risk pop up publicly, right? So the problem is most people think, well, we'll just fix it and keep moving on. Just go in there and fix it. Well, you have to architect it correctly first. So most of the time when we have a customer come to us, we say, well, let's just stop everything you're doing today. Let's just redesign it from scratch, start the governance like you mentioned, start with ensuring that you're moving the right services to the cloud, right? Because you have to understand your customer needs, your business needs, and you can't just necessarily move everything quickly because you could break applications, right? But once you're there, the next step is the key step, is optimization. So cost optimization to me is very important, and actually, first of all, does anybody have a cost optimization resource at all if you're in the cloud right now? Anybody? You do? Share, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about, pass to you, hold on. Put you on the spot.
For cost optimization? Yeah. So we started migrating or utilizing the cloud in late 2016, early 2017 for the low-hanging fruit of DR that you mentioned before, and for high-performance computing. And those were the two no-brainers that was easy for us to step in. And then shortly thereafter, it was just like, well, it was a big push to try to move as much stuff as we could, which led to a lot of sprawl, which led to a lot of over-expenditure. So we've taken, over the course of the last few months, we've kind of slowed down. We're continuing to still migrate services, but then we're taking a hard look at consolidation, removing stale and stagnant stray devices that are running in the cloud, turning off any development type systems at night, consolidating things to right-sized virtual machines, and looking at serverless architecture and microservices where we can. So we're really trying to move away where we can from, running a virtual machine with SQL Server with antivirus and, security updates, to running a more service-oriented platform to where and our analysis of that has shown that we can spend probably dimes on the dollar compared to what we're doing today. So last year, I think we spent close to $750,000 for our cloud spend, but for a medium-sized organization, not that bad. And this year, I think we've cut that by about 40 to 50% by paying a lot of attention to our spend.
That's great feedback.
So just to share, that's an important resource, process, whatever you want to call it. You have to have it. Do it quarterly, monthly, semi-annually, doesn't matter, right? It's everything from right-sizing. It's about reviewing, knowing, and even, actually, does everybody know about ITIL process pretty well? So an ITIL process, every time you have a service, you should have an expiration date on it. And if the expiration date hits, the service owner has to validate if that service expires. Follow the same process in the cloud for every IaaS, PaaS, SaaS solution. And the last piece I want to add to it is re-architecture. By default, most people go to an IaaS solution in the cloud. They'll set up a VM, start moving to it. That's the most expensive service you can buy in the cloud. Start looking at PaaS, looking at SaaS, re-architect your solutions. Spend the initial money up front so you can have the savings long term. So those are the areas I've seen.
I'm curious, Ismael, just with the global footprint, have you seen WAN costs change or increase because of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we move a lot of data. We have petabytes of data. So one project will collect a minimum of 8 gigs a day, and we might have hundreds, thousands of projects running. So it's a significant problem for us with WAN usage. But more critical than just let's say bandwidth or performance of WAN is the things that you just couldn't anticipate. For instance, I think one big mistake we made, I'll call it a mistake, is investing in appliances that cache your data in the cloud. So it's I'm not going to name a vendor, but an appliance basically stores your data in some kind of cloud object storage and then gives you a local cache. It works great for a lot of scenarios. For ours, it doesn't. And the reason is that we move so much data and we access so much data that we will fully starve the thing of cache. And so now you have data going up and down, up and down. So what ends up happening is you consume all your WAN bandwidth, you cost yourself a tremendous amount on egress fees, and so it really helps to have a solid plan and a good understanding up front of what your usage model is for that data. In our case, for that kind of data, it just makes sense to put it in the cloud, and if it needs to be processed, process it in the cloud.
Hey, just one more quick question on platform as a service. When you or in your organization, have you refactored applications to leverage PaaS, or is that something that's still, not really ready for prime time?
Yeah, we've done both. So I think most people, as Sohail said, they do a lift and shift to get into the cloud. It's just I've got some VMs, I'm going to move them up. In our case, we're doing a lot of software development all the time, so we have the opportunity to reconsider. And it's a challenge because of course you've got to justify the time for people. But what we found is that it's definitely worth justifying the time. So we've taken the time to take traditional applications that were, let's say, a Windows application that had a local database server that's on the same LAN, to turn that into a web application that has services back end that talks to object storage. And what ends up happening is not only is your performance going to increase, your resiliency increases, your availability, and your scale. And that's been for us the most critical thing, because as our business is expanding, in the old days it was a huge burden to expand. But once you move to PaaS services and you're leveraging scalable API-based services, really there's almost no limit to that. At least not any limit we've hit in this current time.
So, Charles, again, from a security perspective, we're talking about now refactoring an application to leverage a platform. What have you seen organizations do? Have you seen organizations take that step, or are they just lifting and shifting workloads into the cloud, and what's the security risks on either side?
I've seen organizations lift and shift and realize that they have overexposed their applications, which were better protected on premise, figure that out the hard way, and then bring it back, and then go, we're going to rebuild this for the cloud, specifically for the cloud. And that, again, is really where you want to understand why you're migrating, what the goal is. And not everybody's goal for getting to the cloud is the same, but I think if you better understand what the goals are, you can make sure that migration is secure.
So, sticking with you for a second, I want to talk about regulatory compliance, something that we obviously deal with our customers quite a bit. And when you start talking about regulatory matters, and now you're dealing with a third-party data center, essentially the cloud, it changes the dynamic substantially. Feedback that you have for our customers who may be dealing with that, well, I can't move to the cloud because of this regulatory requirement. We hear this a lot. We've got to keep our data in our own data centers. Any feedback, or have you seen other organizations go through that and how they've addressed it?
So, unfortunately, a lot of that talk has a lot to do with the auditor that you're experienced with. Here's what's good about today. There isn't a single vertical that doesn't have a cloud footprint that isn't subject to some sort of regulatory compliance. I mean, the federal government, for example, just signed a large contract with Microsoft to do just that for top secret material, which I used to be a custodian of. And so when you think about how you're securing the data, it doesn't matter on what bare metal server it exists. It matters that we verify that it is secure. And to Jeremy's point earlier, our ability to do that is limited. When we leverage good organizations like Microsoft, that lift is a lot less on everybody else actually trying to leverage the cloud. So you have the economy of scale working for you on your behalf. Attestation is so fantastically easier, because in this case, all I need to do is make sure that my service is well architected. I'm leveraging the security framework that Microsoft has provided, and with that, I just download the security compliance annotation directly from a website and say, here's my architecture, here's what it's leveraging inside of Microsoft, that's inherently secure, you can inspect this code, and then you're good to go. So it's actually reducing the burden if you do it properly.
Jeremy, what thoughts do you have on this, again, from a customer perspective, dealing with this where you're leveraging the cloud and you're a financial institution?
As a bank and as a CIO, it obviously keeps me up at night, right? So it is a concern. It goes back to both your culture and your governance and being aware of that. It does relate a lot. I mean, I think the auditors have been especially on the financial services side, have been the ones that have been the most conservative and concerned. But as we start to again go to these partners and they're able to demonstrate the controls, whether it's through a SOC 2 report or a standard just FFIEC controls matrix that demonstrates the actuality, for me, I'm getting far better service out of these third parties than if I were to try to replicate or do it myself in-house on a consistent, ongoing basis. But it is being aware of, again, your own data and where it's going and what's out there and your exposure. There's plenty of stories that we've heard in the news of organizations that have embraced this. And again, it's been, I love the land grab analogy, where suddenly you hear about a database that's out there, publicly exposed, unsecured, default password or blank password that should never have been there. And that's back to, again, understanding that risk and having that governance in place. So for me, it is truly, and fortunately for us, specifically in the banking world, the regulators have embraced that, driven primarily by some of the larger financial institutions that have really pushed and promoted Microsoft and others to really step up their game because they've realized the benefit of that partnership. But it is about having the right governance and controls in place.
So Jovita, I'd like to get you to comment on this, and then we'll take questions. But just from the cloud provider perspective,
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about how serious Microsoft takes regulatory compliance and steps that you've taken?
Very, very seriously. That was one of the things I did at Microsoft. And Jeremy touched on it, right? When you think about how you go about compliance today, internally, just to meet one standard, or maybe just to meet your own corporate policy. But then if you embrace a cloud provider, whether it's a Microsoft, AWS, or Google, you are actually going to, I may say, piggyback or benefit from a ton of compliance work that they've already done, and Charles touched on that, right? So Microsoft, for example, our cloud has 1,114 different controls, meaning third-party audited from all the regions of the world, different industry standards, whether it's SOC 1, SOC 2, ISO 2700, you talk of NIST, you talk of all the different DoD standards, the ones in Japan, GDPR, all those things. Just by coming to the cloud, then give you access to you benefit from this third-party. You benefit from all these controls that we've already built into the platform, right? So start off by asking the service provider, and you don't even need to talk to them directly. If you go to the Cloud Security Alliance, for example, CSA, they have what they call the the Cloud Control Metrics, the CCM, which they use to audit cloud service providers. And they have this thing they call the STAR registry, where you can see all the different compliance frameworks that the Microsofts of the world they've gone through. And then in the federal government, they have this thing called ATO, Authority to Operate. Charles, you know that. Just to get an ATO for a service like Dynamics 365 or Office 365 takes years. And now Microsoft goes through that with the federal government, and then if you come to Microsoft Cloud, you benefit. So it is really a compliance as a service that you get for free by embracing cloud services.
One thing I would add. The only thing that I would add to that is that the carry-on benefit is literally for anything that is native. So one thing that we didn't talk about is the shared security model. There's so much of the compute, the storage, that is naturally provided by Microsoft that they are responsible for securing, and it's their responsibility. So as you are looking at your plans for migration, make sure that you're leveraging their part of the responsibility matrix and giving them all of the responsibility for that, right? So that's how you want to build your infrastructure. You're paying for that cost. The more you build, the more that you keep on your side of the ball, the more risk you own. So make sure that you're leveraging the audited and secure infrastructure for the service that you're paying for.
Well, we lost a microphone, but we're done with the Q&A part, or the question part. So what I want to do now is wrap up and open up to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, again, we've got representatives from both Accudata, Microsoft, and also customers here that can answer any questions for you. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, specifically around the security, talk about, okay, so say I have a Windows server with running SQL Server and it's the database with an application. And we're running antivirus on it, we're running the forensics tool on it, the various expenses that we have in order to keep that secure. When we move to the PaaS, where you're talking about the native SQL Server offering that they have? What do I need to do? How worried should I be about that data and with that? What do they need to do?
Just repeat the question.
Okay, so I'll repeat it. So we have SQL that we're managing today in a more traditional sense. As we move to Azure SQL, what are the things that I need to do to make sure that I'm providing equitable security for my current infrastructure?
Yeah, I'll go first. So if you move that server, the VM, from where it is today, and you lift it and shift it to Azure, for example, you're still going to be responsible for the operating system down, right? That's your responsibility, the antivirus, all the patching, and all that stuff. However, though, if you refactor that and move it into SQL Azure, which is Microsoft Database as a Service, the underlying fabric, the OS, is now managed by Microsoft. That is what Charles just talked about. That environment, you know, from the OS down to the fabric controllers, all the way down to the hardware, is audited by independent third-party auditors. For example, ISO 2700, right? But then if you go a step higher, let's say you want to do SaaS, Office 365, you have additional benefits from a compliance standpoint. So the shared responsibility model really is shifting that responsibility from you, the traditional IT, to the cloud service providers, and just saying, I use a very rudimentary analogy earlier on. Think of the old days when you had generators providing electricity. You buy your generator, you put it in your backyard. You have to buy diesel and put it in that generator. You have to repair it, maintain it, right? You have to secure it from thieves and from all kinds of hazards, whether it's the weather also. But then if you decide today and say you just want to buy a service from Centerpoint Energy, what now the NUC, the North American Reliability Council, or ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, regulate these electric companies, and you know they are regulated. Same thing with the cloud providers, right? Sorry.
It's okay. So Brian, I think a couple other things you have to think about is, yes, IaaS is no longer your responsibility, right? But since you deployed SQL, you have stored procedures, you have databases, you have identities. All those things are still on you. So if somebody writes a stored procedure, all those things are on you, yeah. And you have to be careful with that because, for example, one firewall mistake, I talked about a healthcare provider earlier, that was a firewall mistake for a PaaS service. And it made that data available publicly. Luckily, nobody saw it until it is regular. So you have to do governance. You have to architect it correctly. Do not use an existing tenant because you played with it. The things we talked about earlier are very key to ensure security. Microsoft and other providers are creating private PaaS, and that's releasing. That's going to make things a little bit easier, right? But at the same time, even if somebody's in your network, you can't trust everything, zero trust model, right? You can't trust anybody. If you have actually I dealt a lot with SLED market, which is school districts and colleges. Kids love to play. And you have to give them access, right? Because they have to be able to get to their services. So they are the best hackers in the world because they have time, they have the internet, they have YouTube, they have IRC channels, and they will attack all day long. So for them, that's a huge challenge because their internal users are always attacking. So be very, very, you can't just automatically trust that your cloud provider is going to do it. Now, it is their responsibility, but the liability is on you. It's your job, right? So
there's two layers to this that I hope you take away. One, segmentation is super important, right? There was an evolution where you would have separate, networks and separate accounts. We're to the point now where we have separate credit cards for separate actual Azure accounts, right? And that level of segmentation reduces the blast radius in the case that something happens. And so that's a level of governance that you want to look at. Very, very much look at the database as your crown jewels and how much access do you want to have that's associated with any other of your Azure access, right? So that's something that you want to look at. The other thing that you do is when you go with Azure SQL, all of the analytics from a security perspective that you would be hoping for, you get that from that native fabric, right? And so Azure Sentinel, for example, any irregular access, I'm able to now take a look at. without having to install anything or inhibit the architecture for the actual application. And so there's a much greater benefit, compliance aside, that you can generate just by making sure that you're leveraging the breadth of Microsoft as a whole. So there are some challenges, making sure that you have irregular access to the databases. There are things that you can do to automate your visibility to that and leverage, again, the Microsoft framework to give you the alerting and have that actually pop up in Teams. But the real goal here is to make sure that you know what access you have, you build the governance model around that, and then you leverage Accudata or Microsoft to give you the requirement that you need to operate securely. That's what I would tell you for that.
So real quick, so from your model, and you're talking about what to be concerned about, I think one thing to really consider is that these sort of traditional on-prem databases will have a single username and password that everyone is using to access the database. That's bad practice, shouldn't happen, but it's the reality. And if anybody in this room says it didn't happen, you're fooling yourself, right? We all know it happens, but in the cloud, it's really important to manage identity, and it's really important to manage that identity across services, because you may have a web application that's going to access a data. You want to make sure that you have identified your user, and that when that user tries to perform an action, that you're still API to API checking the identity. That's a big change for a lot of developers. It's a really hard thing to overcome. But what I would say is both AWS and Microsoft have tremendous expertise in it, and they offer a lot of help. So those are the kind of questions I would go talk to, is how do I make sure that I know who the user is in all these interactions?
Any other questions? Any other questions? Yeah.
So a customer earlier asked me about the crazy cost of the cloud. So who is worried about that right now? The cost, there you go. So if you, we talked about cost optimization, right? That's one tactic. I'm actually very curious. Has anybody else done anything different outside of that? I will take that as a no. So back to my earlier comment, I think Chris was talking about it as well. We have to do cost optimization, right? Either do it yourself, buy a tool, which tool will only give you so much limitations, or go find a company to do it for you. Either way, you need to do it. If not, you're going to get that crazy bill at the end of the month, which, if you guys remember cell phone bills in the old days, that crazy cell phone bill of the month, that's $1,000 that you have to pay for. Those are the issues you will run into, right? So back to the gentleman who asked me a question earlier, that's a very key thing that you guys have to that everybody's got to focus on, especially in the upcoming year.
And that is especially a big problem for companies that have an OpEx model, right? A lot of the oil and gas companies are CapEx driven. They don't like OpEx, right? So, but then when you go to the cloud and it's a subscription model where you start paying monthly, it then bumps up your OpEx cost, and the accountants usually frown against that, because they say, oh, wow, we are a CapEx company. How come our OpEx is also going up? So one of the things, and so you keep touching on this, and it's a key point that folks don't realize, is the what they call the cloud financial model, where you want to say, all right, how do I adjust my financial model to suit the cloud? It used to be the cloud providers had no response, but over the last few years or so, we do sell things like reserve instances, which could then be capitalized and booked today for consumption over the next 3 to 5 years, which then reduces OpEx. But you also mentioned right sizing. If you lift and shift to the cloud, where you take a VM that may or may not have been right sized and you bring that to the cloud, it's going to be expensive, right? So there are the gentleman who just left. He talked of some really cool things they're doing, whether it's using microservices or having VMs that are dev test VMs instead of traditional VMs. So I think Sohail and his team and some people at Microsoft can work with you to come up with smart ways of embracing the cloud, and also be aware of what we call or some may call hidden charges, right? You take the cost of a storage or a NIC card. When you deploy a VM, you'll be charged for a NIC card, right? You'll be charged for a load balancer. All those things add up to the cost. The VM may be just $1 per hour, but then you have all these other underlying costs, which we try to make sure that you are aware of, and we actually have a service that will tell you, hey, this VM is going to cost you exactly this much with all those other services. So when you go out there, you talked earlier on whether it's a VM that is exposed to the internet, Security Center will warn you against that, but Advisor will also warn you against the cost. So again, Sohail and Accudata folks and people at Microsoft or any other consulting company will be able to sit down with you and model that out to avoid the cell phone company experience that Sohail, you talked about that? Right. So we don't want that to happen, to be honest.
All right, I want to thank everybody for coming. How about a round of applause for our panelists? I know this was time out of your day, so we greatly appreciate it.